The sun was a merciless hammer over Redemption Gulch, beating the dust into a fine, choking powder that settled on everything, a constant pale shroud. It settled on the raw timber of the general store, on the drooping heads of the salvia in the Widow Abernathy's window box, and on the shoulders of the men who loitered in the slivers of shade, their eyes narrowed against the glare. They watched Lynn Finn walk. They always watched her. She moved as if gliding through a different element, a river of calm in a stagnant, dusty pond. Her dress, a Chong Sam of the palest pink silk, was an act of defiance in this world of brown and gray. It clung to her slender frame, its high collar a fortress of dignity, the fabric whispering a language no one here understood. She carried no basket, no parcel. Her hands were empty, her back straight, her destination a place no respectable woman in town would willingly go. She was heading for the far end of the street, where the blacksmith's forge fell silent and the corrals began, leading to the solitary ranch of a man spoken of only in low, cautious tones. His name was Clay. He was not a man known for his conversation, but for the stark, unnerving stillness that surrounded him. He was mending a leather strap on a bridle, his back to the town, a broad and uninviting landscape of muscle and sun-darkened cotton. He worked with an economy of motion that was both efficient and intimidating, each movement precise, final. The town held its breath as Lynn Finn approached him. The usual murmur of gossip and complaint died, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. She stopped a few feet from him, a small, vibrant figure against the vast, bleached backdrop of the plains. He did not turn. He simply stopped his work, his hands frozen over the leather. He knew she was there. A man like Clay knew everything that moved within his sphere. "Mr. Clay," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried across the unnatural hush, clear as a bell. He remained motionless for another long moment, letting the silence stretch until it was thin and taut. Then, slowly, he turned. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, and they held no welcome. They held nothing at all, a terrifying emptiness that had sent bigger men scurrying. He looked at the pink dress, at the carefully pinned black hair, at the resolute set of her jaw. He waited. "I have a proposal for you," she continued, her gaze unwavering. The men in the shade leaned forward, straining to hear. "I wish for you to marry me." A collective, silent gasp seemed to ripple through the town. It was madness. A delicate foreign widow, a woman of grace and quiet sorrow, proposing marriage to the most feared man in the territory. Clay's expression did not change. The stony mask remained intact. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. Not as a curiosity, but as a puzzle. His eyes traveled from her face down to her feet and back up again. The silence deepened, becoming heavy, suffocating. He could have laughed. He could have cursed. He could have simply turned his back and returned to his work, a dismissal more brutal than any word. Instead, after a lifetime of silence seemed to pass, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. He said 4 words back. "Show me your hands." Lynn Finn did not hesitate. It was a strange request, a bizarre and intimate command in this most public of spaces, but she understood it was a test. Everything with this man was a test. She extended her hands, palms up, the gesture one of surrender, but her posture one of defiance. The pale pink silk of her sleeves slid back to reveal her wrists, slender and fine-boned. Clay took a step forward, closing the small distance between them. The town watched, mesmerized by the unfolding drama. He did not touch her. He simply bent his head slightly, his stormy eyes examining her palms with an unnerving intensity, as if he were reading a map to a hidden treasure, or a secret sin. Her hands were not the soft, pampered appendages of a porcelain doll, as the dress might have suggested. The town saw only the widow, the exotic flower wilting in their harsh soil. Clay saw the truth written in her skin. He saw the faint, silvery lines of old burns along the edges of her fingers, the kind a person gets from years of tending a stove. He saw the distinct thickening of the skin at the base of her fingers and across her palms, the unmistakable calluses of hard, repetitive labor, of scrubbing and kneading and wringing and digging. There was a small puckered scar near her thumb, long since healed, a testament to a moment of carelessness with a sharp knife. These were not the hands of a helpless woman seeking a protector. They were the hands of a survivor, a worker. They were hands that knew grief and toil in equal measure. He looked from her hands back to her face. Her expression was serene, patient. She was not pleading. She was offering a contract, and her hands were her credentials. He had expected tears, desperation, the cloying scent of fear. He found none of it. He found only a quiet, formidable strength, a resilience that resonated with the granite core of his own being. He straightened up, the moment of inspection over. The silence from the onlookers was now a palpable thing, a pressure on the air. They expected a rejection, a cruel dismissal that would confirm their every prejudice about both the strange woman and the fearsome man. Clay's gaze swept over them, a brief, contemptuous glance that made several men flinch and look away. He had always despised their petty judgments, their whispered cruelties. Her audacity in this moment was a stone thrown into their stagnant pond, and he found he admired the ripples. He turned his attention back to Lim Finn. "The justice of the peace," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Now." It was not a question. It was a command, an acceptance, a decree. He turned without another word and started walking toward the dusty, clapboard building that served as the town's legal center. For a moment, Lin Finn remained where she was, her hands still slightly extended. Then, slowly, she lowered them, a single, deep breath escaping her lips. She smoothed the front of her pink dress, a gesture of composing herself for a battle already won, and followed him, her steps as measured and graceful as they had been on her approach, leaving the stunned and silent town behind them. The office of the Justice of the Peace smelled of stale tobacco and forgotten laws. Judge Miller, a man whose jowls shook with perpetual disapproval, peered over his spectacles at the unlikely pair standing before him. He looked from Clay's impassive, sun-scorched face to Lin Finn's composed porcelain features, and his mouth soured as if he'd bitten into a lemon. The whole town was talking, the news spreading faster than a prairie fire. He had seen it from his window, the feared rancher and the Chinese widow walking side by side, a gulf of silent space between them, yet moving with a shared, inexorable purpose. It felt unnatural, an affront to the established order of things. "You're sure about this?" Judge Miller asked, directing the question to Clay but letting his gaze linger judgmentally on Lin Finn. He saw her pink dress as a garish flag of otherness, an inappropriate splash of color in their sober world. Clay did not answer. He simply placed $2 silver on the dusty desk, the sound a sharp, definitive clang in the quiet room. It was payment, not a request for an opinion. The message was clear. Do your job. The judge sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of his reluctance. He shuffled through some papers, found the correct ledger, and dipped his pen in the inkwell. The ceremony was a barren affair, stripped of all sentiment. The judge mumbled the words, his voice a droning monotone that sucked the life from the vows. He spoke of union and partnership, but the air in the room was thick with the reality of the transaction. Lin Finn stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her, her eyes fixed on a crack in the plaster wall behind the judge's head. She spoke her assent in a clear, steady voice. Clay's "I do" was a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. There was no exchange of rings, no gentle touch of hands, no kiss. When the judge declared them man and wife, Clay simply nodded once, a curt, final gesture. He turned and walked out, leaving Lynn Finn to sign her name in the ledger. Her characters were elegant and precise, a beautiful, alien script beside Clay's brutal, angular signature. She followed him out into the blinding afternoon sun. The town was still watching, but from a greater distance now, as if the official sanction of the law had somehow made the pair even more intimidating. They did not speak as they walked out of town, past the last of the dusty houses and onto the open track that led to his property. The landscape unfolded around them, vast and unforgiving. The heat shimmered off the baked earth, and the sky was a relentless, empty blue. His ranch was set far back from the road, a collection of stark, functional buildings hunkered down against the horizon. The house was simple, solid, built of dark timber that had been weathered by years of sun and wind. It had a porch, but no rocking chair, no welcoming adornments. It was a shelter, not a home. As they approached, the silence between them grew. No longer the tense quiet of a negotiation, but the vast, uncertain silence of a shared future. He led her to the front door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her enter. The interior was like the man himself, spare, clean, and shadowed. The house was larger inside than it appeared, but it held a profound emptiness. The main room contained a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a cold fireplace, and a single bookshelf holding a half-dozen worn volumes. There were no curtains on the windows, allowing the harsh afternoon light to slice across the floorboards, illuminating dancing motes of dust. The air was cool and still, smelling of wood smoke and leather and solitude. It was a place where a man could live for years without leaving a trace of his soul. Lynn Finn stood in the center of the room, her pink dress a shocking intrusion of life and color in the monastic gloom. She felt like a wildflower someone had mistakenly pressed between the pages of a dry, forgotten book. Clay moved past her, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He did not offer her a seat or a glass of water. He walked to a closed door and opened it. "This will be your room," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet house. She looked inside. It contained a narrow bed with a simple wool blanket folded neatly at its foot, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single wooden chest for her belongings. It was as barren as a cell, but it was clean. The window looked out not toward the town, but east, across the endless rolling plains. It was a room with a view of nothing and everything. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He grunted in response, a sound that was neither agreement nor dismissal. He then pointed to another door at the opposite end of the main room. "That one is mine." The geography of their new life was established in that single moment. 2 separate rooms, 2 separate lives, connected by a silent, shared space. He left her then, walking back out the front door without another word, the screen door slapping shut behind him. She heard the crunch of his boots on the dry ground as he walked away, presumably back to the work she had interrupted. Lynn Finn was alone. She walked into her assigned room and placed her small, cloth-wrapped bundle on the chest. It contained all she had in the world: another dress, this one a practical dark blue, a few personal items, and a small, smooth stone her mother had given her years ago, a token of a life she could barely remember. She went to the window and looked out at the vast, indifferent land. She had traded one form of isolation for another. In town, she had been surrounded by people, yet utterly alone, an object of suspicion and pity. Here, the loneliness was purer, more honest. It was in the air, in the soil, in the heart of the man who was now her husband. She wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But then she remembered the leering eyes of the men in town, the whispers that followed her everywhere, the ever-present threat of a poverty that would swallow her whole. No, this was not a mistake. It was a chance. A stark, terrifying chance, but a chance nonetheless. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall down her back in a cascade of black silk. The first night in her new home, she did not cry. She simply sat on the edge of the bed and watched the sun go down, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, colors as vibrant and out of place as her own pink dress. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. A routine, unspoken and unnegotiated, began to form between them, a silent dance of cohabitation. Lynn Finn rose before dawn while the sky was still a bruised purple. She would move quietly through the house, lighting the stove, her soft slippers making no sound on the floorboards. By the time Clay emerged from his room, smelling of sleep and the outdoors, there would be coffee brewing and a simple breakfast of biscuits or oatmeal on the table. He would eat without a word, his eyes focused on the table in front of him, and then he would leave, disappearing into the vastness of his land until dusk. She never asked where he was going or what he did. His life outside the house remained a mystery, a closed book she had no right to open. Her domain was the house and the small patch of land behind it. She spent her days in a flurry of quiet activity. She wore her practical blue dress now, the pink one carefully folded and put away in the chest. She scrubbed the floors until the old wood gleamed, chased away the persistent dust that tried to reclaim the sparsely furnished rooms, and washed the windows until the harsh landscape outside seemed sharper, more vivid. She found a neglected vegetable patch behind the house, the soil hard and cracked, but not without promise. With a rusty spade she found in the barn, she began to turn the earth. She worked with the same methodical determination he applied to his own tasks, her hands, which he had judged so carefully, becoming coated in the rich, dark soil. She planted seeds she had carefully saved, beans, squash, and hardy greens. Tending the small garden became her ritual, a way of imposing order and life onto a patch of his desolate world. In the evenings she would cook. The smells that filled the small house were new and strange to it. Ginger, star anise, the scent of simmering broths. She was a resourceful cook, making the most of the simple provisions from his pantry. When he returned at sunset, weary and covered in the dust of his labor, he would find a plate of food waiting for him on the table. He never commented on the meals, but she noticed he always cleaned his plate. They ate in silence, seated at opposite ends of the long table, the space between them a silent testament to their arrangement. The only sounds were the scrape of cutlery on ceramic and the sigh of the wind outside the windows. After dinner, he would sometimes sit on the porch, staring out into the deepening twilight. She would remain inside, clearing the table, the soft clink of dishes the only response to the chirping of the crickets. She learned the rhythms of his moods through the sounds he made. The heavy, even tread of his boots meant the day had been ordinary. A quicker, more agitated step signaled frustration, and on rare occasions there was a dragging weariness in his walk that spoke of exhaustion so deep it was almost despair. She observed him as he observed her, both of them cataloging the small details, learning the habits of the stranger with whom they now shared a life. It was not a marriage of affection, but of necessity. Yet, in the shared silence and the steady rhythm of their days, a fragile kind of peace began to take root, as tentative and persistent as the first green shoots in her newly turned garden. The summer heat intensified, pressing down on the plains with a suffocating weight. The sky remained a hard, cloudless blue for weeks, and the earth in Lin Finn's garden grew thirsty. One afternoon, a change began to stir in the air. The wind, usually a hot, steady breath, grew fitful and agitated. To the west, a line of dark clouds began to build, a bruised and turbulent wall rising from the horizon. Lin Finn watched it from the kitchen window, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She had seen storms like this gather before, storms that carried not just rain but a destructive fury. Clay came in from the fields earlier than usual, his face grim. The restless energy of the approaching storm seemed to have seeped into him. "Storm's coming," he said, the words clipped. It was the most he had said to her all week. A bad one. He didn't look at her, already moving through the house, checking the latches on the windows. She saw him glance toward the barn, his jaw tight with concern. The animals, his horses, were his only real companions, the only living things to which he showed any open tenderness. "The north fence is weak," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "That last section near the creek." He grabbed a heavy canvas coat from a peg by the door, his movements quick and decisive. He was heading back out, into the teeth of the approaching maelstrom. A sudden, unexpected impulse moved her. "I will help," she said. He stopped, his hand on the door, and turned to look at her. His expression was one of sheer surprise, as if she had just started speaking in a language he'd never heard. The idea of this small, quiet woman offering to help with ranch work was, on its face, absurd. "This is not work for you," he said, his tone flat, dismissing her. "I am stronger than I look," she replied, her chin lifting slightly. She remembered the look on his face when he had examined her hands. He knew what she was capable of. A flicker of something, annoyance, respect, confusion, crossed his features. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. He didn't have time to argue. "Stay close," he growled, and pushed the door open, striding out into the maelstrom. She followed him without hesitation. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy. The world had turned a sickly shade of gray-green. The air was electric. By the time they reached the far fence line, the storm had broken in earnest. Rain lashed down, driven almost horizontal by the wind, stinging their faces and soaking them in seconds. He worked with a focused intensity, his powerful hands wrestling with splintered posts and tangled wire. He had brought tools, and he moved with a familiar efficiency, but the wind fought him at every turn. Lynn Finn did not wait for instructions. She saw what needed to be done. She gathered the loose wires, her smaller fingers better able to untangle the knots. She held the posts steady against the buffeting wind while he hammered them into the soaked ground. Her dress was plastered to her body, and mud caked her ankles, but she did not falter. They worked in a strange, synchronized rhythm, a team forged in the heart of the storm. At one point, a powerful gust of wind caught a loose fence post, threatening to send it crashing down on him. Without thinking, she threw her entire body weight against it, her shoulder digging into the rough wood, her feet sliding in the mud as she held it steady. He glanced at her, his eyes wide with surprise for a split second, before he drove the final spike home. They finished as the heart of the storm passed over them, leaving a world washed clean and trembling in its wake. They walked back to the house in the dripping twilight, soaked and exhausted. As they stepped onto the porch, he stopped and looked at her, truly looked at her, his usual mask of indifference stripped away by the storm. "You did good work," he said. The simple words of praise, so unexpected, landed in the quiet air between them with the weight of a solemn vow. The storm broke more than just the weather. It broke the rigid silence that had defined their existence. The shared struggle against the elements had created a small crack in the wall between them, and in the days that followed, something new began to seep through. They still did not speak much, but the quality of the silence changed. It was no longer a void, an absence of communication, but a space of shared understanding, a comfortable quiet that did not need to be filled. Clay started leaving things for her. One morning, she found a small bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen table, their vibrant purple and yellow heads a stark contrast to the dark wood. They were nothing fancy, just hardy blooms he must have picked from the edge of the prairie, but the gesture was monumental. She put them in a glass jar of water and set them in the center of the table, a small sun in their Spartan home. A few days later, she found a freshly repaired handle on the old water pump, the wood sanded smooth to prevent splinters. She knew he had done it, taking a moment from his endless work to fix something for her comfort. Lynn Finn, in turn, found her own ways of reaching across the divide. She began mending his work shirts, her stitches small and neat, almost invisible. He would find a torn sleeve repaired, a missing button replaced, without a word ever being exchanged. She noticed the way he would sometimes rub his shoulder after a long day, a subtle sign of a deep, aching weariness. That evening, she heated water and mixed it with herbs from her garden, creating a soothing soak. She left the basin and a clean cloth on the washstand in his room. She heard him enter later, the pause in his movements, and then the soft splash of water. When he emerged for dinner, the tightness around his eyes had eased, and he moved with less stiffness. A silent gratitude flowed between them. One evening, as she sat on the porch steps watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, he came and sat on the top step, a few feet away from her. He didn't speak, just cleaned a piece of tack, the rhythmic scrape of his knife on the leather, a soothing sound in the twilight. She thought about her first husband, a gentle scholar who had dreamed of making his fortune, but had understood nothing of this harsh land. He had loved her, she knew, but his love had been a fragile thing, easily broken. He had left her with debts and the pitying, contemptuous stares of the town. He had promised her protection and given her only vulnerability. This man, Clay, had promised her nothing. Theirs was a contract, a marriage of convenience. Yet, here on this porch, in the quiet companionship of the falling night, she felt a sense of safety she had not known since she was a child. She had come to him seeking a shield, and she was beginning to discover the man behind it. She stole a glance at him. In the soft light, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. He was staring out at the horizon, at the land that was his whole world. She wondered what had carved such deep loneliness into him. What past sorrows had built the fortress of silence he inhabited? She did not know his story, but she was beginning to learn his language, a language of actions, not words, of wildflowers and mended fences. The town of Redemption Gulch had not forgotten them. Their strange marriage was still a source of endless speculation and gossip. Mr. Abernathy, the store owner, was the primary purveyor of this news. When Lynn Finn went to town for supplies, a rare trip she made only when absolutely necessary, she could feel the weight of his prying eyes. He was always polite to her face, a thin, greasy civility, but she knew he dissected her every purchase, her every word, for the benefit of his customers. One sweltering afternoon, Clay needed a specific part for a piece of farm equipment that had broken. He decided to go into town himself, a rare occurrence. Lynn Finn chose to accompany him. She needed thread and salt, but more than that, a quiet, unacknowledged part of her did not want him to go alone. As they walked down the main street, a hush fell, just as it had the day she had made her proposal. But this time, the silence was different. It was less about shock and more about a simmering resentment. Their continued quiet existence was an affront to the town's predictions of disaster. Two men, loafers who were always propped against the saloon wall, detached themselves and blocked their path. They were the same men whose leering looks had so often followed Lynn Finn before her marriage. One of them, a burly man with a stained beard named Finch, smirked at Clay. "Well, look what we have here," Finch drawled, his eyes sliding over to Lynn Finn with insolent appraisal. "Decided to bring your pretty little mail-order bride out for some air?" Clay stopped. He did not tense, did not reach for the pistol at his hip. He simply went still. A terrifying, absolute stillness that seemed to drain the heat and noise from the air around them. "Get out of my way, Finch," he said, his voice low and dangerously calm. The other man laughed, a high, nervous sound. We just want to know how much she cost you. Maybe we could make a better offer." Lin Finn felt a surge of cold fury, but she did not move. She stood beside Clay, not behind him. She met Finch's gaze directly, her own expression unreadable, and held it. She would not be cowed. She would not let them see her fear. Finch took a step forward, his bravado fueled by the audience gathering on the boardwalk. "She probably don't even speak English proper. What do you two even talk about?" Clay moved then. It wasn't fast, but it was with a lethal grace that was mesmerizing. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply shifted his weight, and his left hand shot out, grabbing the front of Finch's shirt, twisting the fabric until the man was choking, his feet barely touching the ground. Clay's face was inches from his. "We don't talk," Clay whispered, the sound more menacing than any shout. "And you want to know why we don't have to? Because she has more honor in her little finger than this entire town has in its rotten heart. Now you will apologize to my wife, and then you will disappear." Finch's face had turned a mottled purple. He clawed at Clay's wrist, but it was like trying to move granite. He gurgled, his eyes wide with panic. I'm sorry," he choked out, the words barely audible. Clay held him for a moment longer, his stormy eyes boring into Finch's, and then he released him. The man stumbled back, gasping for air, and scrambled away, his friend trailing hastily behind him. Clay stood for a moment, his chest rising and falling slowly. He turned to Lin Finn. His face was a mask again, but his eyes held a fire she had never seen before. He simply nodded toward the general store, and they continued their walk as if nothing had happened, the silent town parting before them like a sea. The walk back to the ranch was conducted in a profound silence. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched out before them like accusations. The confrontation in town hung in the air between them, an unspoken thing, heavier than the satchel of supplies Lin Finn carried. Clay walked with his usual long, ground-eating strides, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw set in a rigid line. The quiet fury that had radiated from him on the street had now receded deep inside, leaving behind a familiar, impenetrable stillness. But Lin Finn could feel the difference. It was the stillness of a tightly coiled spring, not of emptiness. She watched the way the muscles in his back moved beneath his shirt, the tension in his shoulders. He had defended her, not just her safety, but her honor. He had called her his wife, and the word, spoken in anger to a loathsome man, had carried more weight than the judge's mumbled pronouncement had. It was a claiming, a public declaration that went far beyond the legalities of their arrangement. When they reached the house, the familiar routine of the evening took over, but the undercurrent of tension remained. She put away the supplies, her movements precise and quiet. He went to the barn to tend to the horses, a ritual that always seemed to calm the turmoil within him. She prepared dinner, the familiar smells filling the kitchen, a small anchor of normalcy in a day that had been anything but. They ate at the table in their usual silence, but tonight it felt different, charged with everything that had not been said. After the meal, she cleared the dishes while he went out to the porch. A few minutes later, she dried her hands and followed him, a rare break in her own routine. She found him not on the steps, but leaning against one of the support posts, staring out into the star-dusted darkness. The moon was a slender crescent, providing just enough light to trace his silhouette against the vast, black canvas of the night. She stood in the doorway for a moment, hesitating. This was his space, his sanctuary of solitude. "What they said," she began, her voice soft, tentative, "it does not matter to me." He didn't turn, but she saw his shoulders stiffen slightly. "It matters to me," he said, his voice a low rumble. He finally turned his head, his face cloaked in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. No one has the right to look at you that way. No one. In his words, she heard the echo of a lifetime of slights, of being judged and found wanting by a world that did not understand him. He was not just defending her, he was defending a principle, the right to be treated with a basic human dignity he himself was so often denied. She took a few steps onto the porch, closing the distance between them until she was standing just a few feet away. The air was cool now, fragrant with the smell of dust and dry grass and the faint scent of the herbs from her garden. "Why did you marry me, Clay?" she asked, the question that had lain dormant in her heart for months. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the chirping of crickets. She thought he would not answer. "Because," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name, "when I looked at your hands, I saw that you knew how to hold on. I was tired of being with people who only knew how to let go." His words settled in the quiet space between them, a confession more intimate than any touch. She understood then. His fearfulness was a wall built to keep out a world that had only ever disappointed him, a world of people who fled from hardship, who broke their promises, who let go. In her calloused hands he had not just seen a worker, he had seen a kindred spirit, someone who endured, someone who held on. The vast, lonely landscape of his heart was suddenly illuminated for her, and she saw the profound solitude he had lived with for so long. She closed the final few feet between them, her soft slippers making no sound on the weathered porch boards. She stopped directly in front of him, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She looked up at his shadowed face, at the hard lines that spoke of a difficult life, and she felt not fear, but a deep, aching tenderness. Slowly, as if testing the air for a trap, she reached out and took his hand. It was large and rough, the skin calloused and scarred from years of hard labor, a mirror of her own, only larger, stronger. His fingers were stiff at first, unaccustomed to such a gentle, unprompted touch. He did not pull away. His gaze dropped from her face to their joined hands, a silent question in his eyes. Her fingers curled around his, a simple, trusting gesture. It was an answer. It said, "I am not letting go." Something in him seemed to break then, a quiet, internal surrender. His own fingers relaxed, curling around hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a movement so soft, so tentative, it was almost heartbreaking. It was the first time they had touched with any intention beyond necessity, and the connection was electric, a current of unspoken understanding flowing between them. They stood like that for a long time as the moon climbed higher in the sky, two solitary figures who had found an anchor in one another. The silence that enveloped them was no longer empty or tense, but full and deep, a peaceful quiet brimming with all the things that no longer needed to be said. He had given her his name and his protection. She had given him her resilience and her quiet strength. Here on this porch, under a canopy of stars, they had finally given each other trust. He looked down at her, and in the faint moonlight, she saw the storm in his eyes had finally calmed. What remained was a stillness that was not empty, but deep and clear, like a mountain lake at dawn. The feared cowboy and the Chinese widow were no longer just parties to a contract. They were two people who had found a home in the barren landscape of each other's solitude. The pink Cheong Sam, folded away in a chest, had been a symbol of her defiance and otherness. But her true strength, she now realized, had always been in her hands. The hands that could cook and clean and garden, the hands that could hold on through a storm, the hands that now rested so securely in his. He squeezed her hand gently, a final, silent promise. She squeezed back. It was enough.